Hello, I'm Donald McCauley and welcome to medicsvoices.com. We talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today we're in Derry on the island of Ireland and we're talking to Professor Louise Dubras. Louise, this is a really exciting time. You're moving on to new horizons. But let's start at the very beginning because you were born on another small island. Tell us about growing up on the Channel Islands.
Gracious, that's a lovely place to start. Yes, I was born in Jersey, in the Channel Islands, and that was, in fact, 15 years after the end of the Second World War. And the reason that matters is because my childhood was shaped by my father's experiences living under enemy occupation in the war. So my dad left school very young and went straight to work. His family were of humble beginnings, and his ambition ultimately was to just own a house that he could walk around. My mother had been through the bombings in Birmingham through the war as well. So my parents were shaped by the war, and that shaped me. They were absolutely committed to us, my sister and I, having a good education, and for them to do the best for us to enable those things. So when perhaps I was being naughty at school and being a bit probably ADHD undiagnosed, I think what my parents were keen to do was to see what they could do to enable that, and so that led to them supporting both my sporting activities, but also those academic activities. And I have said repeatedly, I think I was very lucky because in those days when women weren't encouraged to do a lot of things and people would say, oh, you can't do X or you can't do Y, they just said yes. And that was one of the reasons I think that I was able to go to medical school. It was one of the reasons that I learned to sail, which very much shaped my journey through my adult life, I guess. So I suppose that's a sense of the real roots that for perhaps how I've grown up the way I grew up.
Well, let's talk about the academic first. So tell us about school. What first attracted you to medicine?
Oh, I didn't want to be a doctor. I actually loved I loved words. I've always loved kind of what the power of words, and I wanted to be a journalist. I think that probably combined my fascination with language and narrative with my interest in people and perhaps why people do what they do. But I was also good at science. So I took sciences at school, and then I thought that perhaps what I wanted to do was to be a scientist and do medical biochemistry. And then by chance at a family wedding, I met a doctor who said, well, if you want to be a scientist and you want to do research, then actually why don't you go and train as a doctor? And so it was a bit of a last minute decision really to apply to medicine. But that's what happened. But I've never lost that kind of fascination with, I suppose, the humanities and the value of words and stories.
Well, in parallel to your academic career in school and in college, you had this sporting career. So tell us about it.
Well, I'm not sure career is the best description, Donald, but I mean, actually, I'm rubbish at sports. I'm really bad at sports because I can't see properly. I have amblyopia, so I've got no 3D vision. So the money that my poor parents spent on tennis coaching was always going to be wasted because I might as well have had no strings in a racket. So I was a swimmer. That was always my sport. And was I competitive? Yes. I have to say, my children will always tell you I'm a bit competitive. But actually, when I was being particularly naughty at school, the head teacher summoned my mum and dad and said, I think Louise is bored, you better do something with her excess energy. So my dad and I learnt to sail together. And actually it was the sailing which really informed so much of what I've learnt and done in my life, because you know, I was talking about how they encouraged me and didn't say no. There was an opportunity for me to go off and do some sailing with the Sail Training Association, which was a fantastic charity then. And I went off and did 2 weeks tour ship sailing, and then I guess they saw that I had some leadership qualities, and so they invited me back as a watch leader. And so I did a couple of trips with them doing that sort of leadership role, and I was probably 15, 16 at the time. I think I was the youngest watch leader that they'd ever had, and then I just did bits and pieces. I was always keen to sail, always enjoyed the physical kind of. There's something about sailing or horse riding which didn't require me to see properly because I did it all by feel. So yeah, it enabled me to kind of, I suppose, form healthy relationships. I went to a girls' school, and all of a sudden I was having healthy relationships with boys through sailing, which was probably also a great relief to my parents. But then, of course, that shaped what I was doing as a young doctor too.
Okay, well, you've introduced this little diversion, so let's move on a little bit from that, because I don't buy this bits and pieces business, because you went on to become part of a pioneering group of women who really pushed out the boundaries in sailing.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, I blame Gloria Hannaford in that I genuinely wasn't part of the plan, but life throws things at us, doesn't it? And there I was as a junior doctor working in London, doing my GP training, but life had thrown events at me. It was a relationship that had founded, and I was sort of looking for something to help, you know, kind of, I suppose, restore my confidence, to be honest. And a friend had heard the skipper of this yacht being interviewed on the radio, and she was looking for a woman doctor who knew how to sail. And my friend said, "Oh, I know who that person is." So I contacted the radio show and tracked down the skipper, who was a lady called Tracy Edwards, who was trying to put together a project which was an all-female crew to compete in what was then the Whitbread Round the World race. And she was trying to source sponsorship, and a boat and a crew. But yeah, I kind of went and met her. She got the boat, and I joined that crew, and it was fascinating as an experience, in that no women had done that before. There was nothing written about how you do it. There was no textbook, and there was no journal article about how you set up a medical kit for a boat to go around the world and into the Southern Ocean. So I spoke to a couple of people who had done it before. It was a Norwegian chap who'd done it twice, and he was, again, quite a kind of pioneering type who just said, "Oh, well, just do blah blah blah." And so I then had to do a lot of thinking about, well, what does it mean to be a doctor in that environment? Never mind, what does it mean to be a woman doctor in that environment, caring for other women? And then we had to launch ourselves out against, you know, kind of not terribly good publicity. The press they were scathing, I would say. But we proved we could do it. And now I learnt a lot about being in a team in that setting. I learnt that when you have to trust your life to a functioning team, that when that team isn't functional, that actually you have to then make a decision about where your priorities lie. So I decided, after 2 Atlantic crossings with them, that I didn't feel that team and I fitted in that I needed them to look after me as well as me look after them. And I needed also to give them a chance to find somebody to replace me. And I realised that there weren't many women around who wanted to do that. So I decided to leave the crew after 2 Atlantic crossings. I felt 6,000 miles was, you know, was enough.
Well, this pioneering spirit and this team spirit
Mm.
brought you on to the rest of your career, because then you went on to become a GP, but you looked after a particular group of patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, life catches up with us, doesn't it? And I think if we think about our careers as doctors in some way, in some kind of hermetic kind of bubble, is somehow divorced from the rest of what happens to us as people. I think we're disillusioned. I actually was working in a practice in the south of England, as a partner. But what happened was I had 2 children, and the requirements of the partnership just didn't fit with what I was able to give as a mum with 2 young children. So I stepped away from the partnership and then thought, okay, now what? But actually a job was advertised for 1 half day a week looking after homeless people in the south of England, in Southampton. So I applied for that and got that post. And it was just the most amazing opportunity, and I loved it. I loved the authenticity of that role. I loved the patients, and I suppose it probably, although I didn't think about it at the time, probably comes back to this narrative stuff, the stories that people have, their backstories, their personal journeys. And I could feel a real connection with those patients in a way that perhaps I hadn't with my very sort of middle class, fairly well off people. And I suppose the other thing that was wonderful about that work was that the team, it was a fantastic team. It was a nurse-led team. Again, I suppose we kind of did a load of initiatives. So we were one of the second wave pilots of personal medical services practices within the UK, because we needed to have proper funding to deliver a proper 24-hour service for those patients. And we set up alcohol day detox. We set up a pilot for kind of transitional care for patients coming out of hospitals. Sadly, the funding came to an end for both of those, but it was just such a wonderful time. I mean, it was nearly 20 years that I did that work.
Well, then you moved into undergraduate teaching. You moved into looking after the curriculum in Southampton. Tell us about that experience.
Well, that again, it's always started with patients, and it started with my homeless patients who've got a bad deal with going into hospital and being, particularly in relation to their opiate use. And I felt that we needed to do better for patients, and you can either go in and kind of talk towards staff, or you can think, well, actually, I want to try and do something a bit more fundamental, which is to help educate students so that they're kind of more confident in managing those patients from an early point in their careers. So I negotiated, and we set up a subject in the curriculum called alcohol and addiction, which I believe is still part and parcel of their offering. And from the experiences there, and also doing some GP teaching for third year medical students, I suppose I never had a plan, just to say, but I was sort of, I think I was able to demonstrate that I could do things, and I could be innovative, and I could lead a team and have an impact. So it went from GP teaching and subject teaching to leading the third year, and then I was asked to lead the review of the curriculum and lead the programme. I think I was just in the right place at the right time.
Well, then you moved to King's College. Now, King's College was a shotgun marriage of 3 medical schools. That must have been an interesting experience.
Oh my word, it was. And of course, that, you're right, it was one of the first things I was told was, this isn't well, it was King's College London was my employer, but I was at the GKT School of Medical Education, which was Guy's, King's and Thomas's, and never to forget that. And I'd applied for a job in Southampton and not been successful with that. And I suppose when you've poured your energies into looking at your skill set, you kind of have written your CV, and then for whatever reason, you're not the right fit for that job. But having put in the effort and thinking, well, what can I do? That was when the job came up as the Deputy Dean of Medical Education there. And they were engaged in a huge curriculum review, and they're also a huge medical school. So I went from a year group of sort of 270 in Southampton to a year group of 400. So that was 2,000 odd medical students. And the pace of that review was fast. And what had happened was, there was some fantastic innovation being proposed, but there hadn't really been any work done in thinking about how that would be implemented and who was going to do it, and actually the detail behind writing the curriculum. Now, when I hear myself saying that, I think, gracious me, I've never been a very good detail person. But equally, I'm a very practical person, and I know that if you're going to take some great ideas, you have to give people the right structures, and you have to have the right oversight and governance to make that real and meaningful for students, and also to make it deliverable. So I put a huge amount of effort into pulling that team together and to writing the curriculum. When I say writing it, it needed a huge amount doing. So I negotiated to bring everybody to a hotel for a weekend, and basically wouldn't let them leave until they'd come up with all of the outcomes and all of the kind of oversight of the curriculum and those high-level achievements. And then I took a week and worked from home and wrote it. I took all of those flip charts and all of those mind maps and kind of made that happen. And then we went through the university processes and started it. So that was an adventure. But I think what I was able to do working in that setting was to connect with some really amazing people, and right back to all of the stuff where I started, because it was all about, well, where are we going to put in the humanities? Where are we going to connect students with not just quality improvement and not just the science of medicine, but how are we going to enable them to connect with the arts of medicine? So I was very fortunate in that time to have those opportunities.
So this was your opportunity to bring back your English interest and your journalism into the curriculum. Now, curriculum development, academics know, is incredibly technical, incredibly difficult. But one thing that jumped out at me in your interest in curriculum is that at one stage you introduced a new module for students going as nursing auxiliaries, wasn't it?
Yeah, gosh, yes. That was something that we did in Southampton, and it was a way to try and manage, I suppose, the issues that students face regularly about being, well, if you go back to educational theory and you think about sort of legitimate peripheral participation, they didn't even feel legitimate peripheral participants when they went from the sort of theory-based time into clinical settings. Students were like rabbits in headlights, and there's a huge amount of literature that will kind of talk about that kind of transitional and that growth of professional identity and how that happens, and some of the traumas that students experience when they're sort of parachuted into clinical settings in a very ill-prepared sort of way. And so the idea of placing students into a clinical setting with a different focus was where that came from. And it was really because what we wanted them to learn was to learn about being in the clinical environment without the additional kind of cognitive work of learning medicine. So that was essentially the rationale behind that initiative. And we piloted with a very small scale pilot, and then we kind of grew it to a bigger pilot, and then we implemented it for a whole year group. But it was a massive amount of work with Trust in Southampton, and I have to say, fantastic collaborative working there, because if they hadn't been willing to enable that for us, It would never have happened. But I remember some of the student evaluations from early on with that work, and they, for example, a student who'd just been asked to do one-to-one nursing with an elderly patient with Alzheimer's, talking about just how they had no idea really quite how demanding that was. And then another student said, I had no idea how backbreaking nursing was. And so I think that they gained enormous insights into actually what was entailed in the care of patients, and watching how teams function in a ward when the doctors aren't there.
So you bring all this experience of the academic curriculum development, the practical experience of students, and your interest in team building to your new role here in the University of Ulster. That was a challenge.
Yes. But, oh gosh, I think in everything that I have done, and I suspect in everything that lots of us do through our professional lives, we know it'll be a challenge, but maybe we don't know quite how much of a challenge it's going to be, and probably if we did, we wouldn't do it. But the challenge here was about learning about the environment, and it's about when you work in university, and actually when you work in the health service, there's a lot of small p politics going on, but actually I also had to learn big P politics here, and I think there was also very much a cultural transition. I hadn't been prepared for how different Northern Ireland was to the rest of the UK, and that ranged from how companies do business to literally the politics of the place and the legacy and the history and so on. But I was really well supported when I got here, and I was able to make the connections I needed to make. And I was also lucky that, I suppose, the growing of the team, I started small. And it's always good, isn't it, when you start small with a core team, and then the expansion isn't just you as the pioneer, but you've got that core team around who are there with you doing it together.
Well, you started with a blank page, and you brought your first cohort of medical students who will qualify this year.
Mm-hmm.
That must be a wonderful, rewarding experience.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, there were certainly times along the way where I thought, is this actually going to happen? Will we be able to make this happen? I suppose it wasn't a blank page, which is important. I'd love to have started with a blank page, but we started with a partner medical school, which was St George's in London, which is now City St George's. But we had their curriculum. Now, what we did have to do was we had to adapt all of that for local delivery. So there was a huge amount of negotiation with lots of stakeholders, and determining whether we could find recruit simulated patients who would enable us to deliver on some of the cases we were working on, and so on. But nonetheless, it's been a remarkable journey. And I think what I love most about the team and growing that team is that anybody, I think, who commits themselves to coming to a new medical school and doing something like this, every single one of them is brave. Every single one of them is prepared to take a risk. And so I have this fantastic team of people who've come from around the world, and who bring their academic rigor and their expertise and their willingness to do something new to what we have been doing. And I think that's really enabled the success.
So having brought this team together, and you're now standing on the quayside as they sail off for the future of the medical school, what will you say to them as they leave?
Actually, primarily, you've got this. You can do this. You are a really capable, competent group of people, and I have no doubts and no concerns that you can just take it to the next steps.
And obviously the final question must be to ask you, and what is the future for yourself?
The future for me is oh gosh, I've actually not really planned it. I've deliberately planned to not fill it yet, because my life has been so full of work and so full of everybody else's agendas that I haven't really allowed myself time to decide what my own agenda is. And I feel a need to be creative in some way, but I haven't actually decided what that's going to be. And I sort of want it to evolve. I want there to be a little bit of an organic process in my head, and I want the opportunity to get bored, because I feel out of that I will then be able to start to formulate what it is I really want to do. So I don't quite know, but it won't be nothing, and I think it'll be something creative. Watch this space.
It's interesting to hear you say about you're going to take time to think about what you're going to do, because I'm not sure that you actually realize what you've achieved. To create this medical school and launch these new group of doctors, having started essentially from scratch, has been a wonderful achievement. And I have to say, I greatly applaud you for that. Louise Dubras, thank you very much indeed for chatting to us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Donald. It's been such a pleasure.